مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في الوقت الذي يركز فيه الكل على مباراة الملاكمة للوزن الثقيل لهذا القرن، وهي المعركة بين اثنين من مرشحين الأقل شعبية للرئاسة على مر التاريخ السياسي الأمريكي، بدأت الساعة تدق مؤذنة برحيل إدارة الرئيس أوباما، ولهذا علامات كثيرة. بدأ الرئيس يلتقي بمانحين لمناقشة أمر بناء مكتبته. بدأت الصحف تكتب مقالات عن أين سيعيش الرئيس حين يغادر منصبه في يناير المقبل. وربما الأهم من كل ذلك، بدأ المحيطون بالرئيس يتخلون عن حذرهم ويفتحون أفواههم ليدلوا بتصريحات إلى وسائل الإعلام يقولون فيها أشياء ما كانوا يقولوها أبدا في الوقت السابق من ولاية الرئيس. المثال الأكثر وضوحا على هذا هو لقاء نشرته نيويورك تايمز مع بن رودز، نائب مستشار الأمن القومي والخبير الاستراتيجي الأبرز وكاتب خطابات الرئيس المتعلقة بالسياسة الخارجية. في ذلك المقال بدأ رودز وكانه يوجه الإهانات للكل في واشنطن، الصحفيون والخبراء ومراكز الأبحاث، بإياهه عن البيت الأبيض روج للاتفاق النووي الإيراني من خلال سلسلة من الحقائق المغلوطة. ما مدى صحة هذا؟ وبما يحيي عن السياسات والسياسة الخارجية في أمريكا اليوم؟ لمناقشة هذه الموضوعات يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة تقدم الخبيرين السياسيين ستيف كليمنز وبيتر همفري. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Steve Clemens and Peter Humphrey to discuss Ben Rhodes, strategic communications, and did the Obama administration lie about the Iran nuclear deal? So, gentlemen, thank you for being with me today.
Great to be with you.
So, Steve, who is Ben Rhodes, and does he matter?
Ben Rhodes matters a lot. Ben Rhodes is the President's Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications. He shapes the President's messaging to journalists like myself, to the Washington and broader community, to try to put the White House's spin on everything the President of the United States is up to, and tries to distract from the things the President doesn't want the press looking at. That's what a strategic advisor does.
All right, but what does this term mean, strategic communications? Is this just a fancy term for public relations?
It's more than that. It's bigger. It has strategic goals. A classic example from history was what the KGB did in Soviet times. They would plant a story with a friendly reporter, and they would hope that that story ran into the certain publications, and that it was echoed by other people on the staff, and then it was echoed by other publications in that country, and then it was echoed again by other publications in other countries. They call this a spike. And a successful spike can run the globe if it's well done. And the KGB did a pretty good job at times. A great example of that is the story that somehow the United States invented AIDS in a biological weapons laboratory. This story, as absurd as it is because the virus predates the United States itself, ran around the world. It was picked up in Africa, it was passed around Africa, and before long it found traction in liberal circles throughout the world. And this thing ran for years, that the United States was somehow responsible for AIDS. That was a very successful spike. Did the CIA do the same thing? Maybe. Maybe not as viciously, and maybe not with as many half-truths.
All right, so but Peter's just used the KGB as the model and the context for strategic communications. What does the term mean in practice, and 21st century America?
Well, I think what it means here is we have a lot of challenges out in the world, whether it's defining for Americans what American initiatives are in Afghanistan, or dealing with Iraq or Israel-Palestine issues, what may be going on with ISIS and terrorism. There is always a debate and a kind of negotiation over there over what the truth is as it's delivered to Americans. It's really the responsibility of journalists not to be dependent on the White House and on the government to feed it material. But that's just not the way the real world works. The White House has enormous power in helping to pace the information that comes out, helping to channel it, helping to shape how some initiative is seen, whether it's normalizing Cuba or whether it's selling the Iran deal in this particular case. And in that, the strategic dimension of it is really to inculcate, to guide, and to shape journalists like myself, their impressions of what the White House initiatives are. That's what is happening. I think it's perhaps less insidious than what Peter just said about the KGB, and it's something every White House does, not just the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the previous Bush administration, the Reagan administration. They're all engaged in this kind of strategic
Some do it
pace
better
setting
than
for
others.
journalists. Yes.
Some do it better than others. Okay, so let's talk about the specific case. Here we have a huge explosion that followed the publication of a major article in the New York Times, America's newspaper of record, a newspaper that supported the Iran nuclear deal, a profile of this government official in which he made some revelations that triggered an explosion of interest, including congressional hearings. What was so novel about what he said in this article? Peter?
There were attempts to explain to the American people that the reason great progress had been made on the Iran deal was the election of a so-called moderate Iranian Rouhani. And the lie is that these negotiations had been going on for a very long time before that. They were going on during the Ahmadinejad regime in Oman. And there had been rumors leaking out of Oman that these talks were going on with a member of the Axis of Evil. And sure enough, this was going on, but the State Department spokesman blatantly lied during a news conference saying that no such talks were going on. And so the spin was that the election of Rouhani would allow for an opening that would allow for the Iran deal to come to fruition. So the corruption of the timeline is a big problem. And to have our State Department spokesman lie so blatantly is a big problem. So the American people don't want to be lied to. So even if they agree with the deal, they don't want to be lied to.
Was that the big revelation?
I disagree with my friend Peter. I mean, I understand the take, but the issue here is, and it's a very, very interesting one, is that I've been reporting on Iran, a potential Iran deal, when another member of this show, Dennis Ross, was working in the White House. I talked to Dennis Ross when they were trying to basically push a Tehran research reactor deal and to test the then Iranian president and the supreme leader's resolve about what was real and not. So many of us that have been doing this for years knew that the spin that Rouhani coming in and Zarif coming in was only a punctuation point. And whether you could see it, it could shape the environment, because in Iran, while it may not be a democracy, it may be a fake democracy, many Iranians feel that in fact they have influence on that process. So the broad question is, how could the White House lie, as Peter just alleged they did, over a timeline, when so many of us have been reporting on the same administration, different players and different initiatives? We're very aware of the earlier initiatives. So, but I don't disagree with Peter in the sense that they did elevate the fact that there was a new breeze in Iran and that created new opportunities. I agree with that.
That's the strategic communication.
But that's the strategic communication. But anyone that had any knowledge, any serious depth, whether it was a David Ignatius of the Washington Post, a Jeff Goldberg at the Atlantic, a Steve Clemens, etc., we have been following this far beyond that little spin popped up.
All right, so, on this point, did the administration lie? Yes or no?
Every administration fibs.
Every fib, I'm not sure if fib translates
fib is a
into
lie.
Arabic.
Every
Fib is
administration
a lie.
lies.
It's a little lie.
Yeah, it's a little lie. Every administration lies, and they're arranged between big lies and little lies. I think this ranks, despite the hoopla, more in the little lie circle than the big lie.
And Peter, what do you call
Definitely a lie,
it?
but maybe a white lie.
A white lie. So that's a different type of lie.
It's when you tell your grandmother she looks great, even though she really doesn't look that great. That's a white lie.
Okay. Now, there were other aspects to this story which gained a lot of attention. Ben Rhodes referred in this article essentially to taking advantage of different actors in Washington for the administration's purpose. Some journalists, some think tanks. He termed this Washington environment, quote, the blob. Yeah. Probably not a word that translates well into Arabic.
Really, why was this New York Times?
What is this?
Why was a New York Times Magazine story so explosive? It's because many people look at the Obama administration as being this sweet and innocent, cuddly, warm and good place that's trying to do good in the world. That's what they're trying to promulgate. The kinds of things we heard from Ben Rhodes would have felt really good in the Nixon administration as soft, you know, and when you look at, or I would even say the George W. Bush administration or anyone that worked in Dick Cheney's office, anything he said would be nothing. But in the Obama administration that pretends or postures itself as a different space, the disdain that Ben Rhodes had for young journalists, or for what he calls the strategic, well, I call the strategic class, what he describes as the blob in Washington, D.C., of like-minded thinkers who can't think strategically or nimbly, and he puts Hillary Clinton in that camp, basically, of people who are just kind of on autopilot on how they think about big military and strategic issues. But the bigger issue is the journalists that he said have never been abroad, who kind of swim along and are basically engaged in groupthink. He said he basically hijacked their brains and put ideas into them because he said they know, quote, absolutely nothing. And let's dissect that for a minute. To a certain degree, he's absolutely right. There are fewer foreign bureaus. There are young people who know absolutely nothing, who have blogs, who write, who may even work for leading journals of opinion like the New York Times and Washington Post. And they aren't of the quality of old-line journalists who are doing this. The truth is, there are some people who are extraordinary journalists. And what I find interesting in this piece is smart journalists wouldn't care about Ben Rhodes and his strategic communications and whether he had disdain for them or not, because they're going to do their own research, their own work, their own due diligence, their own smart investigative reporting. That's what journalism should be. But what Ben is saying is that's not the way this town is working right now. It's weak, it's copycat stuff, it's groupthink, and you know, everything he said in that article is probably more true than not.
Okay, we're going to come back in a minute, and I'm going to ask you whether there is, as Mr. Rhodes suggested, a Washington playbook to address all the problems in the world in just a moment. Again, my panel includes Steve Clemens. Steve is Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic and editor of Atlantic Live. He's also a senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, a prominent think tank here in Washington. Steve writes and speaks frequently about the Washington political scene, foreign policy, and national security issues. Sitting to his right is Peter Humphrey. Peter is a former diplomat, foreign affairs professor, and frequent intelligence analyst, a former Marine geophysicist. He served in the Foreign Service in Mexico City and Rome, then pivoted to serve as a State Department analyst for Iraq and Iran. He subsequently taught at the Pentagon's National Defense University while researching at its Institute for National Strategic Studies. An expert on Middle Eastern, Russian, and Korean issues, he writes regularly on intelligence and international affairs. So, given that you both know so much about international affairs and have been involved in America's policy debates, is there a single Washington playbook that we all turn to solve our international problems. Peter.
Look, the big problem with this story is that it showed, it laid bare a technique for influencing the highest levels of the U.S. government. It's a way to show the world, if it wants to do the same thing amongst American opinion makers, it can do exactly what Ben Rhodes did. And that's really scary. So subsequent people who want to spin issues can use this technique, and people from overseas, for example, China, could do the same thing. And that's why reporters have to question all that stuff that's being passed back and forth on social media. And that's the big change here. It's social media that has allowed us to move to giant spikes, mega spikes.
All right, no, fair enough. But what I want to ask right now is, isn't there a vigorous debate about aspects of foreign policy? I mean, should we expand NATO? Should we not expand NATO? Should we get involved in Iraq? Should we not get involved in Iraq? It's not as though there's a single playbook that we all operate from.
But you know better than anyone that both sides of the issue don't necessarily get covered to the same degree. And that's the concern here.
I think the issue at hand is that it has been rare to find a presidency that was willing to consider an alternative to deep American leadership in almost all of the world's problems. And what you're seeing both in Ben Rhodes' comments and also in the interview that my colleague Jeff Goldberg did with the president called Obama's Doctrine is a willingness to withdraw and essentially let other nations and other stakeholders in the world carry more responsibility than they used to. And you're hearing in the campaign of Donald Trump, renegotiating the equities and responsibilities between allies on institutions like NATO. And I think the important question is, was that debate a brand new debate? Are we in this? And I think there are two answers to that. One is, I remember 10, 15 years ago, or during the Clinton administration, people wondering if NATO still had a purpose, if Russia had become a democracy, and if commerce and multinational corporations were defining globalization in a very different way. And it wasn't clear that we would have any real threats. Tom Friedman wrote The Lexus and the Olive Tree and said every nation to succeed really had to look more and more like the United States. And that is a different time that we're in today. So this notion of a playbook is, there is a strategic class that has long been those that at a very elite level, they used to be the old Soviet watchers, that essentially the high priests of US foreign policy didn't have to worry about where the public was, because they've been the ones to really be the stewards of national security decisions for a long time. Then the Bush administration and the Iraq invasion came, and you began to see surfaced real divisions within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party about what ought to conduct foreign policy. And so there is no playbook today. You have realists and neoconservatives in the GOP, and in the Democratic Party, you've got liberal interventionists, people who want to find every cause to justify, why America exists is to go right every problem else in the world. And you have other Democrats like Bernie Sanders saying that's creating more problems than it's worth. So there is that playbook that we thought we had in the post-World War II era has just come apart. So it's not an accurate statement.
Look, the playbook here is to constrain American military commitment. That's what this is all about. This is a somewhat pacifist administration. They don't want committing American troops hither and yon, this situation, that situation. Any alternative pathway that could be explored to prevent the American commitment, that's what the playbook is. Every single month that we failed to organize some sort of invasion force into Western Iraq and Syria means that girls are being raped dozens of times a day. It means that trenches are being filled up with beheaded people living under Daesh administration. That's an administration that fails to see the utility of military commitments when massive, massive atrocities are going on. And that's the playbook, to constrain American military commitment.
All right, so let me bring back to the episode with the Ben Rhodes story. Because part of this is year 8 of an administration.
Right.
When people either let their guard down or purposefully try to take a victory lap,
right,
which is a different metaphor. Was this a victory lap, or was this letting his guard down?
It could be both. Victory laps are usually conscious decisions, and I don't think that was. I happen to know Ben. He gets 20, 30 requests of this sort. He may or may not have known he was being profiled, but he certainly sat for pictures. I think that the broad question is, this is a guy who sat rather anonymously within the tightest circles around the president and may have at a moment just said, I want to show off a little bit. Or it's the New York Times Magazine and they like us because they supported the Iran deal, and wanted to check off the box and let the world know as he was leaving office that he's a pretty important guy. And you ask, who is Ben Rhodes? Most of the world has no idea who Ben Rhodes is. So it may have been both a letting his guard down, he would never have done this a year ago, and looking at just both from exhaustion, but also the notion that he's going to be moving on to something else in a few months, that this was a victory notch as well.
Peter, Steve, thank you very much for joining us
Thank you.
on Dakhel, Washington.
Thanks a lot.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول قدرة الحكومة على استغلال وسائل الإعلام، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.